Blood is supposedly thicker than water, but put a multi-million-dollar inheritance on the table, and watch how quickly family turns into a pack of starving wolves. One sister was handed a rotting shed, while her brothers took the sprawling mansion. They laughed, entirely unaware of what waited beneath the floorboards. The rain came down in relentless, freezing sheets on the morning Jonathan Whitmore was lowered into the ground. A self-made titan of the upstate New York shipping industry, Jonathan had built a life of staggering wealth and uncompromising discipline. His estate, a sprawling 50-acre property known as Ironwood Manor, sat perched above the Hudson River, a stone monument to his success. Yet, as the attendees gathered under the sea of black umbrellas, the grief felt entirely hollow. Clara Whitmore stood closest to the grave, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her umbrella. At 28, she had spent the last 5 years of her life paused, having abandoned a promising nursing career in Boston to return home and care for her father during his grueling battle with pulmonary fibrosis. She had administered his medications, held his hand through agonizing nights, and listened to his final, raspy whispers. Standing a few feet away, entirely dry under a massive canopy held by a hired assistant, were her older brothers, Simon and Derek. Simon, a corporate liquidator with a sharp jaw and an even sharper conscience, checked his Rolex constantly, treating his father's burial like an overdue board meeting. Derek, a man whose only discernible talent was burning through trust funds at European casinos, stood with his hands in the pockets of a bespoke Italian suit, looking brutally hungover. They had not visited their father in his final 10 months, citing critical business ventures. The true nature of the brothers became glaringly apparent less than 48 hours later. The sprawling mahogany-lined office of Henderson and Associates in Manhattan smelled of old leather and impending conflict. Charles Henderson, a formidable attorney with silver hair and a deeply lined face, sat behind his desk, holding the final testament of Jonathan Whitmore. "I will dispense with the standard pleasantries, as per your father's strict instructions," Henderson said, adjusting his glasses. He looked directly at the 3 siblings. Jonathan was a man who believed in the absolute truth of character. His estate is not to be divided evenly. Simon shifted in his leather chair, a smug, preemptive smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Derek leaned forward, eyes gleaming with unfiltered greed. Clara remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't care about the money. She was simply drowning in the quiet, suffocating vacuum her father had left behind. "To my eldest sons, Simon and Derek," Henderson read, his voice taking on a heavy, formal cadence. "I leave the entirety of Ironwood Manor, including the primary residence, the surrounding 48 acres, and all liquid assets held in my primary accounts at Chase Private Client and Vanguard, to be divided equally between the 2 of you." Derek let out a low, victorious whistle. Simon merely nodded, as if a cosmic error had finally been corrected. The primary estate was valued at roughly $12 million, not including the art collection or the 7-figure brokerage accounts. Henderson cleared his throat, his eyes flashing with a profound, unreadable emotion as he turned to the next page. "And to my daughter, Clara, who stood by me when the house was silent and the nights were long." The lawyer paused, taking a slow breath. "I leave the 2-acre parcel at the southern boundary of the estate, including the groundskeeper's shed and its immediate contents. It is my final wish that she claims this property immediately." Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Clara blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. The southern boundary? The groundskeeper's shed? It was a dilapidated, rotting wooden structure that hadn't been used since the late 90s. It had no plumbing, a sagging roof, and was surrounded by overgrown blackberry brambles. Derek erupted into a sharp, cruel bark of laughter. "A shed? He left you the rusted-out shack by the highway." "Derek, please," Henderson warned sharply. Simon turned to Clara, his expression a mask of manufactured pity masking absolute triumph. "Well, Clara, you always were the rustic type. Don't worry, Derek and I will give you a few days to pack your things from the main house before the staging company arrives. We're putting the manor on the market by the end of the month." Clara didn't argue. She didn't scream or demand a forensic accounting of her father's mental state, though the thought crossed her mind. She simply stood up, thanked Mr. Henderson, and walked out into the cold New York air. Beneath her shock, a quiet, nagging memory echoed in her mind. On his final night, her father had pulled her close, his grip surprisingly strong. "The house is a cage, Clara," he had wheezed. "Look past the rot. Look beneath the surface. Promise me." She had promised, not understanding a single word. By Friday evening, Clara had packed her meager belongings into her 10-year-old Subaru. The brothers had already changed the security codes on the main gates and hired private security to patrol the upper grounds. As she drove down the winding gravel path toward the southern edge of the property, the towering silhouette of Ironwood Manor faded into the rearview mirror. She pulled up to the shed. It was in far worse condition than she remembered. The grey siding was stripped and peeling, covered in a thick layer of creeping ivy that seemed to be the only thing holding the walls together. The roof slumped in the center like a broken spine. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, the hinges screamed in protest. The interior smelled of damp earth, motor oil, and decay. Old lawn mowers, rusted chainsaws, and stacks of rotting cardboard boxes filled the space. It was a dumping ground, a monument to forgotten things. Clara stood in the center of the gloom, the freezing draft biting through her wool coat. She fell to her knees amidst the dust and the rust, burying her face in her hands, and finally let herself cry. She wept for her father, for the brutal betrayal of her brothers, and for the terrifying uncertainty of her future. But as her tears soaked her hands, her eyes locked onto a strange, heavy cast-iron anvil sitting entirely out of place in the far corner of the rotting floor. The first week in the shed was a brutal exercise in survival. Clara spent her days patching the worst of the roof leaks with heavy-duty tarps, and her nights huddled beside a noisy, kerosene space heater she had purchased from a local hardware store. She had less than $2,000 to her name, completely cut off from the family fortune. Up the hill, the contrast was sickening. Simon and Derek wasted no time liquidating their father's legacy. Through the bare winter trees, Clara could see fleets of luxury catering vans and high-end contractors rolling up the manor's driveway. The brothers had immediately taken out a $3 million equity line of credit against the estate through Rockland Trust, using the cash to fund a lavish, continuous celebration of their newfound wealth. At night, the distant, pulsing thud of bass from their parties drifted down the hill, a mocking soundtrack to Clara's freezing isolation. But Clara was not a woman who surrendered easily. Channeling her grief into physical labor, she began clearing the shed. She hauled out rusted engine blocks, dragged away waterlogged mattresses, and burned the moldering cardboard in a fire pit out back. It was on the 7th day, while dismantling a collapsed wooden workbench, that she found it. Wedged between the rotting back legs of the bench was a heavy, rusted Folgers coffee can. Clara pried the plastic lid off expecting to find old nails or screws. Instead, tightly rolled and wrapped in a layer of yellowed wax paper, was a thick stack of architectural blueprints. Clara unrolled them on the dusty floor, shining her flashlight over the faded blue lines. The title block in the corner read, "Ironwood Substructure, 1982, her brow furrowed. The blueprints depicted the shed, but the dimensions were entirely wrong. The document showed a massive reinforced footprint extending deep into the earth, a structure that was easily 2,000 square feet. It looked like a bunker, a subterranean vault that did not exist on any county tax record or property deed Clara had ever seen. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She traced the schematic with a trembling finger. The diagram indicated an access point located precisely in the southeast corner of the shed. Clara scrambled to her feet and looked at the corner. Sitting heavily over the floorboards was the massive cast-iron anvil she had noticed on her first night. It must have weighed 300 pounds. For hours, she pushed, pulled, and wedged an old steel crowbar beneath its base, using pieces of scrap wood for leverage. Blisters burst on her palms, and sweat soaked her shirt despite the freezing temperature. Finally, with a horrific screech of metal on wood, the anvil slid to the side. Beneath it, the floorboards looked completely ordinary. But Clara dropped to her knees, running her hands over the filthy wood. She found a tiny, almost invisible recessed notch in the pine. She wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the seam and pushed down with all her weight. With a heavy, pneumatic hiss that made Clara jump back in shock, a 4-foot square section of the floor popped upward. It wasn't just wood. The boards were mounted to a solid 6-inch thick slab of reinforced steel. Clara grabbed the heavy iron handle that was now exposed and hauled it backward. It swung open on hydraulic hinges, revealing a dark concrete shaft leading downward. A rush of dry, climate-controlled air drifted up from the darkness, smelling faintly of ozone and cedar. It was not the damp, suffocating smell of a root cellar. It was the smell of preservation. Clara found a switch on the wall just inside the hatch. She flipped it. A row of brilliant industrial LED lights flickered to life, illuminating a pristine, reinforced steel staircase descending into the earth. Her breath caught in her throat. Her father's words echoed louder now, ringing like a bell in the silence. Look beneath the surface. Slowly, she descended. The stairs led down at least 20 feet, ending in front of a heavy vault door made of brushed steel. A digital keypad sat next to a heavy biometric handle. There was no keyhole. Clara stared at the keypad, panic fluttering in her chest. She had no idea what the code could be. Her father's birthday? The day the company was founded? She noticed a small, handwritten note taped neatly above the keypad. It was her father's sharp, immaculate handwriting. Clara, the date you came home to save my life. MMD, DYY. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She typed in the date of her return to Ironwood, the day she had left Boston behind without a second thought. A loud electronic chime echoed in the small space, followed by the heavy mechanical thud of locking bolts disengaging. Clara gripped the handle and pulled. The door swung open silently, revealing a massive, brilliantly lit subterranean room. The sheer scale of it stole the air from her lungs. The walls were lined with polished mahogany shelving, but it was what rested on those shelves that made her drop her flashlight. Stacked in immaculate, organized rows were dozens of heavy, waterproof Pelican cases, vintage leather briefcases, and custom velvet display boxes. In the center of the room sat a massive antique mahogany desk, and upon it rested a single sealed envelope with her name on it. Clara approached the desk, her legs trembling. She opened the envelope, unfolding the heavy parchment. "My dearest Clara," the letter began. "If you are reading this, my final test has been completed. I knew Simon and Derek would take the bait. I knew they would demand the grand illusion of wealth, the stone walls, the manicured lawns, the empty prestige. They are fools who do not understand that true power is never displayed in the light. The house belongs to the bank. It is mortgaged to the hilt, burdened by hidden debts I intentionally incurred to teach them a lesson they desperately need." Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Her father had effectively handed her brothers a glittering, debt-riddled anchor. "But this room," the letter continued, "is the true Whitmore legacy. Off the books, off the grid, and entirely yours." Clara slowly reached out and unlatched the nearest velvet display box on the desk. Inside, resting on black silk, was a breathtaking collection of vintage Patek Philippe watches, pieces so rare they had long been considered lost to history. Beside it, a heavy metal lockbox sat slightly ajar. She lifted the lid, revealing rows of pristine, uncirculated 1920s gold certificates and bearer bonds, their astronomical values staring back at her in crisp ink. She wasn't just wealthy. She was sitting on a forgotten empire. And directly above her, oblivious to the fortune resting beneath their feet, her brothers were busy celebrating their own financial ruin. The transition from winter to early spring brought a dramatic shift in the atmosphere surrounding Ironwood Manor, though the brothers remained blissfully ignorant of the storm gathering directly over their heads. Down in the valley, hidden beneath the decaying groundskeeper's shed, Clara Whitmore was meticulously orchestrating her financial resurrection. The subterranean vault was a masterpiece of hidden wealth, but wealth meant nothing if it could not be safely and discreetly legitimized. Clara knew that suddenly appearing with millions in untraceable assets would trigger an immediate investigation by FinCEN and the IRS. She needed a proxy, a professional who operated in the shadows of the ultra-rich. Using a secure satellite phone she found in one of her father's survival kits, she contacted Henrik Vanderbilt, a senior partner at the highly exclusive wealth management firm Bessemer Trust in Manhattan. Her father's letter had specifically named Henrik as the only living confidant who knew of the vault's existence. When Henrik secretly visited the shed in the dead of night, stepping into the glowing bunker, even the seasoned financial veteran was left utterly speechless. Clara handed him a single velvet box containing a pristine, documented 1943 steel Patek Philippe reference 1527. Within 3 weeks, Henrik had arranged a private off-market sale to an anonymous Swiss collector through Philip's auction house in Geneva. The single watch netted Clara $4.2 million, legally transferred into a newly formed corporate entity, Ironwood Heritage Holdings LLC, based out of Delaware. She was no longer the destitute sister freezing in a shack. She was a silent, formidable millionaire. Up the hill, the brothers' reckless victory lap was coming to a screeching, violent halt. Simon and Derek had lived like kings for exactly 90 days. They had purchased matching Porsche 911s, renovated the mansion's south wing with imported Italian marble, and thrown weekend soirees that rivaled Gatsby. But the $3 million line of credit from Rockland Trust was entirely exhausted. What they had failed to realize, what they had been too arrogant to investigate during their rushed probate process, was the labyrinth of toxic debt their father had quietly wrapped around the main estate. Jonathan Whitmore had intentionally cross-collateralized Ironwood Manor with heavily defaulted commercial real estate loans in downtown Detroit. The legal traps were ironclad, drafted by a phantom team of corporate attorneys explicitly designed to trigger immediately upon his death. The estate was fundamentally upside down. It was appraised at $12 million, but the encumbrances and toxic liens totaled closer to $16 million. The first foreclosure notice arrived via certified mail on a damp Tuesday morning. Derek ignored it. Simon, however, understood the severity immediately. His corporate liquidation background suddenly turned into a mirror reflecting his own demise. He spent frantic days on the phone with aggressive creditors from private equity firms, screaming until his voice went hoarse. But the paperwork was bulletproof. The bank was calling the loans due. They had exactly 30 days to produce $14 million, or the property would be seized and auctioned by the state of New York. Panic set in like a slow-acting poison. The catering vans stopped coming. The Porsches were quietly repossessed in the middle of the night. The massive mansion grew cold and silent as the brothers fired the housekeeping staff, unable to make payroll. Desperation breeds audacity, and on a miserable, rain-soaked evening, Simon and Derek marched down the muddy gravel path toward the southern boundary. They hammered violently on the door of the crumbling shed. Clara opened it, dressed in a thick wool sweater, looking serene and entirely unbothered. Behind her, a heavy canvas tarp perfectly concealed the iron hatch leading to her empire. "We need the land, Clara," Simon demanded, bypassing any greeting. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Your 2 acres. It's zoned for commercial development because of the highway frontage. A developer from Toll Brothers just offered us $1 million for it. We need you to sign the deed over to us right now. It will buy us enough time to refinance the main house." Derek stood shivering in his designer trench coat, looking utterly pathetic. "Come on, Clara. We're family. You can't let us lose the house. We'll give you 50 grand out of the sale. You can finally move out of this disgusting squalor." Clara leaned against the doorframe, studying the 2 men who had ruthlessly discarded her just months prior. The irony was exquisite. They were standing mere feet above a fortune that could buy and sell the entire county, begging for a fraction of its worth. "No," Clara said softly. Her voice held no anger, only a quiet, absolute authority. Simon stepped forward, his jaw clenched, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You selfish little brat. We are about to be completely ruined. The bank is going to take everything Dad built. Everything." "Dad built a legacy of discipline, Simon," Clara replied, her gaze piercing right through him. "You built a bonfire and threw his money into it. I am not selling my land to fuel your failures." "You're making a massive mistake," Derek spat, his voice cracking with panic. "When the bank takes the manor, they'll rezone the whole lot. You'll be trapped here, surrounded by subdivisions. You'll have nothing." "I have exactly what Father left me," Clara said smoothly. She stepped back into the gloom of the shed. "Good night, Simon. Good night, Derek. Good luck with the bank." She shut the heavy wooden door, the metallic click of the deadbolt echoing loudly in the rain. Below the floorboards, millions of dollars in rare gold certificates waited in the silence, while her brothers walked back up the hill toward their inevitable, devastating ruin. The Rockland County Courthouse was a bleak, brutalist structure that offered no comfort to those losing their livelihoods within its walls. On a humid Thursday morning in early June, the foreclosure auction of Ironwood Manor was officially underway. Simon and Derek sat in the back row of the gallery, looking like hollowed-out ghosts of their former selves. Their custom suits hung loosely on their frames. Their expressions were painted in absolute defeat. They had exhausted every legal loophole, begged every affluent contact they knew, and failed completely. The bank was stripping them of the title. Because of the sheer volume of toxic debt attached to the property, the opening bid was set criminally low, merely enough to satisfy the primary lien holders and clear the title of its toxic encumbrances. Opening bid for the 50-acre estate known as Ironwood Manor, the auctioneer droned into a crackling microphone, is set at $4.5 million. The room was painfully silent. Given the state of the property's complicated legal history, local investors were terrified to touch it. For a terrifying minute, it seemed the bank would simply absorb the property. Then, a sharp, impeccably dressed attorney in the second row raised a numbered paddle. $4.5 million. Bid acknowledged from the representative of Ironwood Heritage Holdings, LLC, the auctioneer noted. He scanned the room. Do we have 4.6? Any other bids? Simon buried his face in his hands. Derek stared blankly at the floor. The hammer came down with a sharp, fatal crack. Sold. To Ironwood Heritage Holdings. The brothers had 30 days to vacate the premises. It was the most humiliating month of their lives. Without the funds to hire professional movers, Simon and Derek were forced to pack their remaining personal belongings themselves. The sprawling, majestic hallways of the manor echoed with their bitter arguments and shouted accusations. They blamed each other. They blamed the economy. They blamed their father's accountant. The only person they didn't blame was themselves. On their final afternoon, a thick, suffocating summer heat hung over the estate. The brothers stood on the grand front steps, loading the last of their cardboard boxes into the trunk of a rented, heavily dented Nissan Altima. The irony of their departure was cinematic. They were leaving exactly as Clara had left months prior, discarded and broke. As Derek slammed the trunk shut, the heavy crunch of gravel signaled an approaching vehicle. A sleek, midnight black Mercedes-Benz Maybach glided smoothly up the long driveway, stopping precisely at the base of the stone steps. Simon frowned, wiping sweat from his forehead. Is that the bank's inspector? The driver's door opened, and a uniformed chauffeur stepped out, walking around the vehicle to open the rear passenger door. A pair of expensive, understated Italian leather heels stepped onto the gravel. Clara Whitmore emerged from the luxury sedan. She was wearing a tailored, pristine, white linen suit, her hair perfectly styled, a vintage Patek Philippe watch gleaming subtly on her wrist. She looked commanding, powerful, and entirely in her element. Beside her, Charles Henderson, the family attorney, stepped out of the vehicle, holding a leather briefcase. Simon and Derek froze, their mouths slightly parted in absolute bewilderment. They stared at the Maybach, then at their sister, unable to process the visual contradiction. "Clara?" Derek stammered, taking a hesitant step forward. What is this? Whose car is this?" Clara walked slowly up the stone steps, stopping 2 feet away from her brothers. She looked at the rented Nissan, then up at the towering facade of the mansion she had grown up in. "It's mine, Derek," Clara said, her voice smooth and echoing with finality. "You—" Simon's eyes darted frantically between Clara and the attorney. His mind, trained in corporate structure, finally snapped the puzzle pieces together. The blood drained entirely from his face. "Ironwood Heritage Holdings. That was you. You bought the debt. You bought the house." "I merely claimed my inheritance, Simon," Clara corrected gently. "Father knew exactly who you both were. He knew you would take the bait of the mansion and leverage it until it destroyed you. He left the true wealth, The off-book liquid assets, the rare collections, the untraceable bonds, hidden safely beneath the floorboards of a rotting shed you were too arrogant to ever step foot in. Derek's knees buckled slightly, heavily leaning against the bumper of the Nissan. Beneath the shed? You've had millions this whole time while we were drowning. I was surviving, Clara stated coldly, the lingering empathy in her voice finally vanishing. While you threw million-dollar parties on a credit line, I was rebuilding this family's actual foundation. Father wanted the estate protected from the two men who would burn it down for a quick thrill, and he chose the one person who stayed by his side to do it. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, extending a crisp, white envelope toward Simon. Your formal eviction notice, gentlemen. As the new sole proprietor of the estate, Miss Whitmore requires you to vacate the grounds immediately. Security has already been notified to escort you to the county highway. Simon snatched the envelope, his hands shaking violently. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of raw hatred and devastating awe. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse her, to fight. But there was nothing left to fight with. She had won with total, absolute precision. Without another word, Simon turned, grabbed his brother by the collar, and shoved him into the passenger seat of the rented car. Clara stood on the grand stone porch, her arms crossed, watching as the Nissan kicked up a pathetic cloud of dust, disappearing down the long, winding driveway for the very last time. She turned and walked through the heavy oak doors of Ironwood Manor. The house was finally quiet. The rot had been cleared out, and the Whitmore legacy was exactly where it belonged. If this incredible story of hidden fortunes, poetic justice, and familial betrayal kept you on the edge of your seat, don't keep it to yourself. True wealth is often found exactly where people refuse to look, and sometimes the best revenge is simply massive, silent success. Hit that like button if you loved seeing Clara outsmart her greedy brothers. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas and unbelievable historical mysteries.